I always knew science was a pathway to truth, but I made the mistake of thinking as Newtonian deterministic science was a pathway to truth. But actually, quantum physics is right at the core of a much deeper understanding of the nature of reality. I'd say, especially with my work at Harvard Medical School, I taught neurosurgery there for 15 years.
I'm sure many of you have already heard of today's guest, Eben Alexander, MD. Dr. Eben Alexander was an academic neurosurgeon for over 25 years.
Um, and I'd really kind of hit a wall in terms of understanding how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. Well, it all started early in the morning of November 10th, 2008. Woke up with severe back pain. Thought if I got down the hallway into a hot bathtub, maybe that would help. Well, I almost couldn't get out of it. From then on, I was gone from this world for the next 7 days. And the important thing to the scientific community is my coma was caused by meningitis. And the reason that's so crucial is meningitis is such a perfect model for human death. It destroys the human part of the brain.
Yeah. Dr. Eben Alexander thought he knew how the brain, mind, and consciousness worked.
Luckily, I was rescued from that by this slowly spinning light that came towards me, and it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view realm and led me up into this brilliant light of the Gateway Valley. And I cannot put into words the kind of astonishment at the ultra reality of that level. It's much more real than this world. This was an absolutely killer case that should have led to my demise. And yet I ended up making a full recovery. But for me, back in those days, back in 2008, when I went into coma, I was still very much hindered by these false kind of understandings of materialist science that have now been completely disproven. The scientific evidence for the afterlife is now overwhelming.
And now for my conversation with Dr. Eben Alexander. So I know all of you have heard me mention IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, on here quite a bit. I want to let you know that they will host their annual conference August 27th through 31st, just right outside of Chicago. I went to their conference the last 2 years, and I'm going to go again. It was such an amazing and transformative experience. You might have heard me talk about the dance party, for example, plus the researchers that speak are all the ones I'm kind of obsessed with. The conference is expected to draw nearly 1,000 people, and amazing experts will be speaking about near-death experiences and other related phenomena. Dr. Bruce Grayson will be a keynote speaker, as well as some of our other podcast guests, such as Mark Anthony and Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell. You may also recognize her name from the telepathy tapes. Some other keynote speakers I'm super excited about are Raymond Moody and Caroline Meese. The conference also features a healing center with services like Reiki, massage, mediumship, and spiritual counseling. And it's not all near-death experience experts by any means. There are people there who are curious, people who are interested in spirituality, people who are in grief. I had such a transformative experience there both years. The evidence, stories people share, they're all amazing. I also made a few friends who are my friends to this day. This special event will inform, uplift, and inspire you as you spend 4 days getting evidence and spending time with both experts and other people like you who are as fascinated by this phenomena. Visit IANDS.org. That's IANDS.org for more information. I'll provide a link in the show notes. Welcome, everyone, to Dr. Alexander. I am absolutely thrilled to have him on. His book was one of the very first I read in early grief when I just, as a complete materialist, assumed there was no hope. So I'm very grateful to have you on, and I want to thank you for helping me early on in probably what I would call my darkest days.
Well, my pleasure. I'm so glad to hear stories like yours because we can get into dark days as human beings, but we don't have to. So there's some
Mhm.
beautiful ways to realize a deeper truth about our existence, and I think that's the kind of thing that you discovered, I've discovered, and we would like to share.
Yes, yes. So, one of the reasons that I was able to take you seriously was your background and credentials. Would you mind sharing a bit about that?
Okay, well, I grew up in a neurosurgical family. My family very scientific. My father, adoptive father in particular, let me make that crystal clear. I was adopted. That's a huge part of my story. Anybody who's read Proof of Heaven will recognize that challenge. Um, and I always knew science was a pathway to truth. Now, in many ways, my adoptive father already had the answers. He was very scientific, fully versed in modern physics, chemistry, neuroscience, cosmology, and yet he had a very profound, unshakable faith, a belief in a loving personal God and the power of prayer. It's something he put to work in his job as a neurosurgeon. And yet I, growing up in the 60s and 70s, like many of that generation, I always knew science was a pathway to truth, but I made the mistake of thinking as Newtonian deterministic science was a pathway to truth. But actually, quantum physics is right at the core of a much deeper understanding of the nature of reality and free will. And that is something I was just beginning to truly assimilate. So I'd spent much of my life wanting to believe what my father had led me in knowing about the reality of God and prayer. And yet, it was a challenge, and I had trouble demonstrating that. And I'd say, especially with my work at Harvard Medical School, I taught neurosurgery there for 15 years. Um, and I'd really kind of hit a wall in terms of understanding how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. I was deeply steeped, as many scientists are, in the kind of conventional Newtonian deterministic science, and there's no question that can lead you towards atheism. I love how Werner Heisenberg, in a beautiful quote, says the first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will lead you towards atheism, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his uncertainty principle in 1932, and I know exactly what he was saying, as do many scientists who study consciousness now and realize how important quantum physics is in getting to an answer. But for me, back in those days, back in 2008, when I went into coma, I was still very much hindered by these false kind of understandings of materialist science that have now been completely disproven. I mean, the scientific evidence for the afterlife is now overwhelming. Your listeners can go to bigelowinstitute.org. They will find 29 essays there, all written by scientists, all of whom demonstrated at least 5 years of experience working on this afterlife question. And those 29 essays will convince you beyond any reasonable doubt that scientific validation of the afterlife and very strongly of reincarnation already exists. So any scientist who claims to have anything to say about this needs to be very familiar with those essays and their arguments. And then they'll see the richness of the current discussion supporting the reality of the afterlife.
It's encouraging. I like hearing when people say 100% because I'm close, but not there. I still have my dark days and my, oof, I hope, it depends on the day, depends on the mood. This obviously is not an emotionally neutral topic.
Mhm.
So, so you went into your coma. What happened?
Well, it all started early in the morning of November 10th, 2008. Woke up with severe back pain. Thought if I got down the hallway into a hot bathtub, maybe that would help. Well, I almost couldn't get out of it and almost couldn't get back to the bed. Baby steps back to the bed, collapsed writhing in a cold sweat, severe pain. Soon thereafter, my youngest son, Bond, who was 10 years old at the time, came in, saw that Dad wasn't off at work, and not only that, he looked terrible. He started rubbing my head. I felt like he'd driven a white hot spike through my head, and from then on, I was gone from this world for the next 7 days. There's a myth out there perpetuated by an irresponsible writer who is trying to discredit me and pretend that I was in a medically induced coma. And so you'll find medically induced all over the place around my coma in descriptions of it, but the reality is it was not. Um, and the medical records make this very clear. I went deep into coma without any sedation at all. In fact, when I came out of coma on day 7, I was still under very heavy sedation. So you can forget about the sedation part of it. The important thing to the scientific community is my coma was caused by meningitis. And the reason that's so crucial is meningitis is such a perfect model for human death. It destroys the human part of the brain, the outer surface, the neocortex. What all neuroscience insists is crucially responsible for all the details of our conscious awareness is that neocortex. And yet mine was gone, it was off. And that is an absolutely critical part of this understanding of my story. And then I had this incredible spiritual journey, and that's what I describe in great detail in Proof of Heaven and in many web talks I've given on this. But it was in a state of amnesia, very important. I've never heard of amnesia being such a prominent part of somebody's NDE, but it was a very rich and deep part of mine, and I think that was the only way I would ultimately take the whole thing seriously. I had to have an especially deep dive and you'll always find that NDEs are tailored to the individual who has them. There's no other reason for their existence. And yet, when you study them by the hundreds and thousands, you find common patterns that tell us that these are a very routine part of human existence. They reveal a much grander theater of operations for our souls and kind of spiritual selves and essence. So in my journey in this amnesic state, it's starting what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive course, kind of unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello. Seemed to go for a very long time, but luckily I was rescued from that by this slowly spinning light that came towards me, and it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view realm and led me up into this brilliant light of the Gateway Valley. And I cannot put into words the kind of astonishment at the ultra reality of that level. It's much more real than this world. People often think a near-death experience would be kind of vague and murky and dreamlike. This world, the material world in these bodies, that's vague and murky and dreamlike compared to the richness of that spiritual realm. And so in this beautiful Gateway Valley, I saw many Earth-like scenes. There were thousands of beings dancing in the meadow down below. It was surrounded by this green forest, rich, verdant, full of life. There were no signs of any death or decay. In many ways, it was like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul. And I remember seeing all these beings dancing, and in my writings weeks later, I said there were souls between lives, and it was lots of joy and festivity, children playing, dogs jumping, incredible mirth and joy. That's what I was witnessing. I was viewing all this as a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. I never had any body awareness at all during the entire journey. And the best part about it was I wasn't alone on that butterfly wing. There was a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbone, broad smile. And her message to me was deep and delivered telepathically. She never voiced a word. She never had to. And her message was very clear, pure conceptual flow. But when I translated it into our language weeks later, that message was, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. And I cannot tell you how reassuring that message was at that point. And it turns out that that was just kind of a gateway, as I said. That's why I call it the Gateway Valley, because what then happened was the angelic choirs above that were emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. They were kind of ushering me to this new level. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time, which I could vaguely sense from that spiritual level, but all of that collapsing down, all of this much richer ordering of the spiritual realm. And that's a realm where you're completely outside of earth time. That's why when people describe life reviews, they describe birth, death, everything in between. All those events are lived simultaneously from the perspective of that realm. And it also explains so many things. So that, for example, when I discuss reincarnation, some people worry, wait a minute, I don't want my loved one to reincarnate before I get there. But from everything I know about the NDE world, the hospice and palliative care, all of those reflections on this process of dying and of leaving the physical body, say very clearly that it's all really about love and soul journeys. So there's no way that you would ever have a loved one who would reincarnate before they're there to meet you on your own passage. So don't fret about that one tiny bit. Now, in the core realm, as I ascended to these higher levels, I saw all of the, even that spiritual realm collapsing down until I was in a realm of pure oneness. I think you often hear discussions of a boundary. People sense in a near-death experience that if they cross this boundary, they never come back. Well, in many ways, I think by many descriptions I've heard of other NDEs in comparison to mine, I think in some ways I was given a glimpse beyond that boundary, and that's what I describe as the core realm. The core was an infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the divine love of that creative source for the creation. And I also came to see that my very conscious awareness, as it is for all of us, was sourced directly in that God force at the core of the universe. That was not anything that had ever been taught to me in my Methodist or Episcopal churches that I had attended. So important to point out here that NDEs, although the telling of them, the narration, might reflect someone's prior religious beliefs, often the content is not so restricted at all. And that's a very important point because not only did I see the kind of sourcing of my own conscious awareness in that God force in the core realm, but also saw this incredible vision. I call it the Ender's Net vision. That showed me reincarnation and life reviews in a very powerful yet generic form. Given my amnesia, I had no knowledge of Eben Alexander's life, so I was in too deep to have an Eben Alexander life review. But I saw life reviews in a very clear fashion, and how they led to, involved reuniting with souls of departed loved ones, and then coming back to this world in the next incarnations. All of it in a process of growth, transformation, contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. And then there came an ending to my journey. um, I would cycle through these levels multiple times, many lessons, incredibly rich. It's taken me 17 years to even begin to unpack it all. And yet, towards the end, just as I've been told, every time I entered that core, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. There came a time when I could no longer use the memory of the musical notes of those melodies that I heard in these transitions across spiritual levels. And to say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I also knew I could trust that I would be taken care of. And that's exactly what this universe offered up to me because I then saw, I remember thousands of beings going off into the distance, heads bowed, many holding candles, this murmuring energy coming to them, coming to me from them. It was kind of ushering me back to this world. At the time, I thought it was just ushering me back to that kind of primitive earthworm eye view. But ultimately, I then saw six faces that bubbled up out of the muck. They were important because they were family and friends who were there the last 24 to 48 hours of coma. And of great note, many people who were there earlier than that were not in those memories. So the fact that those memories happened at the end of the spiritual journey showed me that the entire spiritual experience had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of a 7-day coma. All that kind of thing is important when you look at the scientific aspects of this and trying to understand when things happened, how they could have happened, given my brain state. And it's important to point out that there is a medical case report on my medical records that makes it very clear this was not just another case of bacterial meningitis. This was an absolutely killer case that should have led to my demise. And yet I ended up making a full recovery. And that case report was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. Um, and they took over 2 years reviewing my medical records and then getting them submitted, finally accepted for publication. Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases accepted this case report. And when they did, they challenged the authors. They said, how do you explain this? It's an unprecedented recovery with these medical parameters showing such destruction of the brain. How do you explain his miraculous recovery over 2 months to complete normalcy? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience. They knew of other cases of near-death experiences with miraculous healing. And I think that to me is the biggest lesson for this world about near-death experiences and healing and wholeness is how they demonstrate very readily this powerful kind of spiritual connection we have that can lead to wholeness and healing in our lives. If we simply awaken to that kind of power that we have as spiritual beings in a spiritual universe.
Yeah, and one thing I won't say what it is here, but there was, you mentioned the woman with the butterfly wings. There was such an evidential twist to that. I mean, you have to read the book. I'm not going to give it away, but that was kind of a
That was
that
giant. Boy,
was
did that get my attention. And that all happened for me 4 months after the coma. And that
mhm,
recognition brought me to my knees when I finally put it all together and identified that guardian angel. I literally couldn't stand up for 30 minutes. I was so, my heart pounding, just, oh my
mhm,
God, what an incredible
mhm.
revelation moment that was for me.
Oh, I could imagine. And I want to ask you, there was just one thing I remember reading it though that concerned me. You did not have any identity. You were not Eben. Do you think there was a reason for that? Does that mean we all lose our identity
No,
when we go to the
no,
other side?
not
Okay.
at all. In fact, a lot of people ask me about that. And like I say, very major point here. NDEs are tailored absolutely for the individual soul who has them. They only
Mhm,
really makes sense in the life of that soul. Now, when we study them in large numbers, they make a lot of sense and they line up to show us this is a very real process for all of us. But the interesting thing is they're always going to take that soul as far as that soul can go in terms of growth in this lifetime. And for me, that necessitated a complete amnesia and a complete deep dive. And that's why, if I had scripted this whole thing, for example, I would have had that guardian angel be my adoptive father. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. He was incredibly influential in my life, such a role model, such a beautiful soul. And yet he was nowhere to be found in my near-death experience. And I only came to realize truly the reason for that about 2.5 years later. And this is all a story that we tell in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that was co-written with my wife and co-partner in a lot of this work, Karen Newell. Um, but that's where I finally encountered the soul of my adoptive father. And he made it clear. When I saw him in this vision, um, he was with his college roommate. They were in their early 20s. He had passed over at age 91. So here he was looking his robust of youthful self, which is often the way light bodies appear to us in NDEs and after death communication. So no surprise at all there. But he made it clear that if he had been apparent to me, as he said, in the NDE, then I would have been more tempted, in spite of the fact it was a 1 in 10 million diagnosis, E. coli meningitis in an adult, 1 in a billion recovery. If my father had been the one there, I would have been a little more tempted to say, oh, you see who you want to see on the way out. It's imaginary, it's wishful thinking. And that's why the universe said, no, no, no. They gave me a much deeper challenge in the form of who my guardian angel would be. And it's all related to that adoption history. It's an absolutely astonishing story. I think that's one reason why people are so excited about the book Proof of Heaven. And God knows it was a gigantic wake-up call for me. But that was really the beginning of my understanding. It seemed way too real to be real because it really happened. And you can't dismiss it. It didn't happen in the material realm, but it happened in a realm, the spiritual realm, that's far more important to us as spiritual beings anyway, even though this is where we get the work done in the material world. That's why I have to encourage people, in knowing about reincarnation. Uh, you should realize suicide is never the correct answer. That's really the biggest message. In all this discussion of the afterlife, and how beautiful it is, you have to make sure people get it, that you don't just get to sit around on a cloud playing a harp all day long and avoiding the problems of this life. This life and the problems that it brings with it are part of soul growth. And it's how we deal with and address the challenges and hardships of this life that we actually grow as souls. And that's why it's so important not to take a shortcut out through suicide and never take another life, because homicide is also a direct violation of some of the deepest principles of all of this.
Yeah, that's important message. I know we can all get to some dark places, especially in early grief. And now, I mean, I'm so glad you didn't stay there, but you think if you were to have stayed, you would have eventually had a life review and re-identified as Eben. You wouldn't have been permanently lost to
No, that
yourself.
was just,
Okay.
you often find that there are kind of halfway steps in terms of
Mhm.
not going all the way to
Do
death. And
stories about near death experiences intrigue and inspire you as much as they do me? I assume they do since you are listening to this episode. Are you encouraged by research about near death experiences and related phenomena? There's a group at the center of this field that was co founded by Dr. Bruce Grayson. It's called the International Association for Near Death Studies, IANDS. I've talked about it on here quite a bit in previous episodes. This year, on the 50th anniversary of the launch of the near death studies field, IANDS has kicked off a chrysalis campaign to grow IANDS so that it can serve the community and the world with important messages learned from near death experiences and solid research from experts in the field. I personally think near death experiences are some of the strongest evidence in favor of survival of consciousness. So, if you join IANDS this summer at the supporting level or higher, or if you make a donation of $100 or more, you'll receive a limited edition commemorative mug, and you'll be helping such important research. IANDS was among the first places I discovered early in my grief, and I cannot recommend them enough. So go to IANDS.org. That's IANDS.org. I'll put the link in the show notes and click on Give to support this important organization. Hey everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality. Okay.
you often find that there are kind of halfway steps in terms of
Mm-hmm.
not going all the way to death in a
Right.
near-death experience. And especially when you start realizing how many near-death experiences are also associated with kind of miraculous recoveries and healing. Then you start realizing the bigger purpose for all of this, but it's all about growth and transformation. And the thing that we call death, death of the body, is actually just a catalyst that allows tremendous soul growth for that individual as they go through their life review, but also for family members around them to either witness the events of their leaving this world, reuniting with souls of departed loved ones, and all of that process can be extremely liberating to us as we wake up to the kind of bigger messages that come through. And I know that many people came to my talks for years, and that includes 2 years of talks before the book Proof of Heaven came out, where I'd share my story, and then people would come up to me afterwards and say, I've never told anybody this before, but. And then they'd share a story with me about something that happened with them around the time of the loss of a loved one or soon thereafter, either a deathbed vision or a shared death experience where their soul went along with the dying soul, even to the point of witnessing a full-blown life review. I mean, shared death experiences are astonishing. They're not uncommon. They're a lot like near-death experiences, and yet they happen in perfectly healthy people. They're a complete argument against the nonsensical materialist pseudo explanations of NDEs like oxygen tension in the brain, CO2 levels, etc., where these people are completely healthy. And when more and more people were telling me those kind of stories, I realized the importance of the dying process and how it can be a gift to us to realize that our loved one doesn't actually end their existence, but they can show us in certain ways that they're still with us.
And now you're a neurosurgeon, you know brains. You examined your medical records afterwards. Do you want to, could, I guess you can explain, I don't know enough of the terms to ask, but essentially it was consciousness would not medically be working in your brain.
Yeah,
Is that
well,
correct?
the deal is that, as I said earlier, meningitis is a perfect model for human death. According to modern neuroscience, the neuroscience I was trained in, every single bit, every atom of perceptual awareness and thinking awareness, what we see around us, what we smell, hear, bodily sensations, frontal lobe executive function, comparing this situation to past situations, predicting the future, memories of past events, every bit of that demands the neocortex. That outer surface of the brain is what's doing all the work, the heavy duty calculations. So meningitis takes that away, especially a very severe case of meningitis like mine. I mean, my cerebrospinal glucose level, and you or me right now, that glucose level would be 80, 90, something in that range. And somebody with severe bacterial meningitis, they might drop their glucose level to 20. Well, my glucose level was 1. And that means the bacteria had long ago run out of sugar to eat in my CSF, and it was destroying my brain. The CT and MRI scan showed full thickness swelling and damage to the brain. No part of it was left unscathed. My brainstem was damaged even on day one. My eye movements were badly altered by this. Glasgow Coma Scale, which you or me would be 15. A corpse gets a 3. Anything below 9 is deep coma. And for most of that week, my Glasgow Coma scale was 6 or 7. It's sometimes probably as low as 5. I lost my oculocardiac reflex. I mean, that's a very deep kind of brainstem sign of brain destruction. These are all terrible signs. And that's why when those doctors wrote the case report and were challenged, how do you explain it? We have no explanation other than the fact he had this profound spiritual experience, a near-death experience. So good. The scientists are paying attention to what really is playing a role here. And just because they can't define it and explain it and measure it, the fact that an NDE is often associated with a miraculous healing is the big message for all of us to pick up on this. And that certainly includes healing physicians and medical scientists.
And do you think this was part of your life plan? Like have this materialist career, have this happen so you could help grieving people? Was it part of
I would
your
say absolutely was part of it. I'm a firm believer that we kind of set up for the events of our lives, and often those events, hard for the ego mind to believe, hard to believe, and yet those events set up by the higher soul and soul group often involve challenges and hardships. So things that we have to face that are tough, illness and injury, things like that. I mean, for me, the adoption abandonment wound, I think was absolutely part of the plan for me. And in so many ways, especially, people who know my full story, they recognize how that adoption abandonment wound could come to a complete resolution through the events that happened when I was 54 years old, going into this deep coma. As a card-toting materialist neuroscientist, having it just thrown in my face that everything I thought was true about the brain, mind, and consciousness was completely wrong. I had it 180 degrees wrong. But luckily, many scientists have been studying this now for more than 6 or 7 decades. And that's where that BigelowInstitute.org group of essays is so important. And also the work, for example, out of University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, UVADOPS.org, you'll find tremendous scientific support for the realities of the afterlife and reincarnation. I mean, they've studied past life memories in children for the last 65 years. And of 2,500 cases at UVA of past life memories in children they've investigated, 1,700 have been solved. That is, they actually found the person who lived before that the child is describing. Because the child gave enough details about names, events, towns, modes of death, etc. And then you do the research and you find these people actually existed. And there's no way the kid could have gotten the information other than through this extraordinary mechanism of reincarnation. So, and also important to point out, most people say, well, wait a minute, I don't remember reincarnation. I don't remember past lives, so it can't be real. Well, guess what? Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson, the doctors who have studied these kids, will tell you you have to harvest these memories in general before age 6 or 7 because there are natural processes that cover them over. I call it programmed forgetting, that we're not meant to carry those memories into adulthood as kind of an ego functioning human. But our higher soul kind of keeps the score and has that kind of data in reserve, and that's part of our subconscious and all of that that plays a bigger role in all this. But it was just a very major eye opener to me. And that was what was so haunting was the more I studied my medical records in those early months, the more I realized, wait a minute, what I went through could not have happened. This brain was far too damaged to host anything that extraordinary, and yet it did. And so also, just parenthetically, I'll point out that studies with psychedelic substances, magic mushrooms, psilocybin, DMT, LSD, etc., multiple studies in the last 11, 12 years have revealed that your brain, under the influence of those substances, your brain is going dark. Just like my brain went dark because of meningitis, I completely identified with these papers on psychedelics that show that when people are having profound experiences on those psychedelic substances, there is no cell or neuronal population in the brain that's having an increase in activity. Every bit of it is a decrease. The default mode network, which is our general idea of what gives us an idea of our sense of self and not doing any particular task, but just existing, that default mode network disappears when you use functional MRI, magnetoencephalography to look at brains under the influence of these substances. So that whole literature on psychedelics fully supports what I went through having this tremendous meningitis associated destruction of my neocortex.
So it's so much of the reverse of what people think. We think our brain creates reality, but it really seems to filter this tiny portion of reality.
It
And
does.
that's, yeah.
Exactly. That's a very important part. And it also, of course, interestingly enough, our brain serves as a transceiver. So once we accept scientifically, no, it's not the producer of consciousness, but it's working as a transceiver, as a kind of a filtering mechanism to allow us access to that much broader universal consciousness, that God mind. And we do have access to that. And when our brain and body die, our access to that God mind enhances tremendously. That's exactly what people are describing. And when you understand that about half of NDEs involve life reviews, then I refer especially to the academic literature on life reviews, and very specifically Bruce Grayson, who's a skeptical psychiatrist who studied near-death experiences for the last 45 plus years. He wrote a paper in the fall of 2021 Journal of Near-Death Studies where he reviewed almost 700 life reviews. Interestingly, he says that a third of them involve your whole life. And most people go, wait a minute, how does a whole life review occur during a 10-minute cardiac arrest? Well, it's because in that realm, you're not restricted by Earth time at all. In that realm, we're completely free to flow across many lifetimes and see much bigger kind of connections in our soul journey. And that's absolutely essential kind of getting of this, that our sense of time in many ways is directly tied in with our very sense of conscious awareness in the here and now. And that's why in our minds, we actually have access to much more than just that. And we see that especially in life reviews. The other important thing about life reviews that Bruce Grayson points out in that article is that about 80, I think it was 84%, I could be a little off in that number, but it's quite high, percentage of people who thought that not only are these events more real than when lived in the material world, but that you in a life review you relive them from the perspective of everyone involved. It's very important. I say it's like we're sharing the dream of the one mind, but that shows you how our ego is a construct, and that in fact our conscious awareness is very much connected with the rest of the universe and with our fellow beings. And that's why in an NDE, people can have profound telepathic connections with people who are still alive, as well as very powerful connections with people who have left the physical plane. In fact, if you look at Gregory Shushan's work, he studied near-death experiences going back in ancient cultures. And he says that is the most universal feature across all cultures, continents, and millennia, is that when you see the soul of a departed loved one, you know that this is the real, true experience. And it's not imagined. These are not imaginary or hallucinatory experiences. It's really them. I describe one such experience in the book Proof of Heaven that happened to a good friend of mine. He happened to be the head of a top neurosurgical training program, so he was very befuddled when he saw his own father having this profound reconnection with the grandmother, that would be the mother of the dying man, profound connection at the moment of his passing. And so it's called terminal lucidity in some settings, but it's astonishing when you see it. But my own mother had a very profound sensing of her own mother that appeared 2 nights before she left this world at age 99 back in April of 2019. And she woke up, got out of bed, which her nurse said should have been impossible, and woke the nurse up and said, "Call my children. My mother's here. She's really here." And unfortunately, the nurse did not call us that night. By the next day, mom was back into an unresponsive state with a mild pneumonia. But I knew she was close to passing, got home, and she passed the next morning. So anyway, it's a very common experience, and I know for certain that given all the other information we have about this, the reincarnation literature, etc., that when you see that soul of a departed loved one, it's not just your wishful thinking and a hopeful memory, but they're really there as a soul to help escort you over.
Now, you mentioned a few things that your near death experience was realer than real, and that in a portion of it, you were out of time, living outside of time. As best as you have words for, like, what is that experience like living out of time? And then in terms of realer than real, like, did you have physical sensations? Like, if I poke my hand now, I feel it. If I'm in a dream and I poke my hand at the moment, I think it's real, but I don't actually feel it. If I dream I'm poking my hand, I'd probably wake up if I did poke it. But is it like heightened sensorily? I'm always
It's
confused what
it's
realer
it,
than real
well,
means.
it's kind of living in that world of ideals where you become, I call it knowledge through identification. You actually
Mhm.
become huge swathes of the scene that you're witnessing. And by doing that, you basically kind of assume different
Mhm.
facets of that dream of the one mind, as I said earlier. And Karen and I often say that the one mind is like this giant diamond, and each one of us, as a sentient being with free will, very important to point out, is a facet of that diamond. And but it is it's very difficult to put into words. It's this kind of complete knowing. People often talk about knowing, and it's a noesis. It's a process of just kind of living that truth, and it progresses. It's something that's shown to you as you go. And it's just a fascinating thing to go through. And it's what gives near-death experiencers this beautiful sense of being free, and of being liberated, and of being much grander, and kind of the bliss of the universe, the bliss that we can only experience in very kind of isolated and minimalist forms in these bodies, that kind of bliss of connection with another soul. In romantic relationships, that kind of thing can be a very powerful kind of agent, especially as it approaches that unconditional love, because that is what is so extremely over the top about the love that one experiences in these spiritual journeys is that I often call it the love of the creator for the creation, but ultimately we're all co-creators with that God force. So it's never as if we're just depending on that God force to accomplish things for us. Might be so from the ego standpoint, but not from our higher soul standpoint. And this is really all about growth and understanding, coming to know thyself. And that's what this whole thing is all about. And that's why I often also encourage people, you don't have to have an NDE to come to know what I know about the reality of this. Get into meditation and centering prayer. These are ways that any and all of us can explore our connection with that primordial mind. And for anyone who needs a tool to quiet the little monkey mind voice in the head, I recommend Sacred Acoustics. Sacredacoustics.com is a great go-to resource if you want to learn more about binaural beat brainwave entrainment. It's what I use. I use Sacred Acoustics an hour or two a day. I've done that for the last 11 or 12 years, all in meditation, getting back to my NDE, not just to harvest memories, but to relive and to develop relationships with with my father's soul, who I described meeting in that book, Living in a Mindful Universe, in deep meditation. That beautiful guardian angel has been a wonderful source of guidance. Just connecting with that God force of pure love. I mean, all of that is what I do through meditation to kind of enhance and further evolve my understanding that was initiated by that near-death experience.
Now, backing up a little to when you came back, you were a materialist. I can relate to that. And I had a very hard time when I was reading the research. I was like, oh, there's a catch. And emotionally, I wanted this to be true more than anything. And logically, I couldn't believe it. So, did you come back? And as you started to become aware of being Eben again, were you like, this is the best thing ever? Were you like, oh my God, none of this a lot? What? I'm not going to put words in your
There
mouth.
was a
How was
lot of
that?
there was a lot of up and down. There was a lot of seesaw, steps
Mm-hmm.
forward, understanding, then backwards, like no way, impossible, boom, bam, bam. I mean, it was
Mm-hmm.
incredible what I went
Mm-hmm.
through in the weeks and months after my coma, trying to make sense of it. Now, important to point out, remember, when I first woke up from coma, my amnesia was still extremely powerful because my brain was
Mm-hmm.
still very addled by this meningitis that it was recovering from. And so when I first woke up, my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside, I had no idea who they were. All I knew was where I'd just been, where I'd spent, it seemed like months or years. It'd been 1 week of Earth time, but in that deep coma, it was an extraordinary journey. And then memories of my life before were starting to come back. In fact, when I first was waking up in that ICU bed, I had no language. Language was minimal, I should say. But language came back very quickly, and a lot of childhood memories in the first hours and days. So quickly, I was in putting together my relationships with these people. But I also went in and out of a crazy 36-hour paranoid delusional nightmare. It's what we call an ICU psychosis. I had that after extubation, after waking up from coma, when my brain was still just fried from this meningitis. And so I was kind of in and out of craziness. But the interesting thing in looking back on it all was the rich spiritual journey. The memories of that are completely intact, absolutely extraordinary, ultra real. The memories of that kind of 36-hour nightmare in coming out of coma, those memories disappeared within a few weeks. So I'm glad I was
Mm-hmm.
busy writing it all down. The other memories, the NDE memories, are rock solid, and there have been scientific papers from multiple groups studying this kind of thing about that resilience of these NDE memories, how they're much more real and solid than memories of most lived events, including very traumatic events. So you can't say that they're hallucinations or dreams because that completely fails in the logical analysis of why they would be so transformational and impactful in people's lives. But anyway, for me, there was this big back and forth. Initially I tried to tell my doctors about all this, and they would pat me on the back and say, "Well, you were very sick. Your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us, but you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks." Well, okay, forget about it, but wow, what a hallucination to go through. I remember when my son got home 2 days after I got out of the hospital, Eben the fourth. He was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time. He knew every time you revisit a memory, you change it. So he told me when he got home, um, gave me a big hug. He said after that, it was like there was a light shining within me, like I was more present than I'd ever been. And I told him it was way too real to be real. He told me, write everything down before you read anybody else's NDE. Very, very
That's so
important.
smart.
And so I had a raw database, 20,000 words that I wrote over the next few weeks. Only then did I start reading the NDE literature. Then I was shocked to find tremendous similarities in what happened to people, how they experienced it, the kind of changes they went through in their understanding of themselves and their reason for existence. And I found great similarities there. That's what's so promising and astonishing about the study of NDEs. So back and forth, back and forth. And then to me, it was almost a deal killer that that beautiful guardian angel had not been my father. But like I said, when I encountered my father's soul 2.5 years later, it became very clear to me why he was not that guardian angel and why I had to have this incredibly important person who I didn't know in my life, but related to me. So all through that adoption story and birth family, etc. Just an absolutely astonishing thing to go through. But it was really that receipt of that picture in the mail 4 months post coma where I went, oh my God. And that's when I finally realized it seemed way too real to be real because it really happened. And ever since then, it's been working with scientific collaborators and other experiencers around the world to come to a deeper understanding of how all this works. But there's no question the evidence leads in one direction, and that's towards the reality of our spiritual selves and the spiritual universe, all interconnected with a shared meaning and purpose. And the materialist perspective, it's bleak and paltry fiction that pretends that when your brain and body die, that's the end of your conscious awareness. Luckily, that is going into extinction because that is a false model of reality. And it's been very damaging to humanity, this false sense of separation. And materialism is what's led to our warfare, conflict, to economic greed, corporate greed, the climate disaster from our addiction to fossil fuels. Every
Mhm.
bit of that is from a false sense of separation that's bundled in with materialist thought. And once the world goes through this transformation of understanding the oneness of mind and the binding force of love, we will start to become a far grander, wiser, and more harmonious civilization and leave behind the wreckage of our materialist malfeasance, nuclear weapons and the weapons of war and all this violence against each other is part of materialism and needs to go away.
If you want to learn how I went from being a skeptical atheist who thought there was zero chance of an afterlife to a skeptical atheist who thinks an afterlife is highly probable, come check out my books. WTF Just Happened.
Leave behind the wreckage of our materialist malfeasance, nuclear weapons and the weapons of war and all this violence against each other is part of materialism and needs to go away.
Yeah. Well, since you went there, climate change and everything, and most of the people I know, I'm not shy about saying this to my listeners, whatever they think, we are not in a good place politically, not, if you're comfortable touching upon that briefly, do you see like that we're moving in a direction getting out of this? It seems like we took some much darker twists instead of progressing. And do you have any thoughts on that as
Well,
someone?
I do. For one thing, I always have believed, since my coma at least, that the hardships and challenges in life are there to help us grow. And that's true for the individual. It's also true for society at large. So I do believe that our current political kind of polarization and conflict is there to serve a purpose. And what I hope in my optimistic moments is it'll help educate us and we will grow beyond this insane kind of fear and paranoia about our fellow beings, start to realize that we're really all in this together. And especially the more you understand someone's backstory, the more you realize that we're all here doing the best we can with what we have. And the more that I can promote a message of love, compassion, kindness, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness, the better I think this world can be. And that's true of all of us. The more we can perpetuate, you know, a much wiser version of Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens means wise, and we call ourselves Homo sapiens. And yes, the wisdom of materialist science, when I look at medical progress, I look at progress in transportation, communication. Yeah, science has done a lot of good in the last few centuries. But then there's also this ugly underbelly. In World War I, the chemists committed their sin, creating explosives, poisonous gases, and machine guns. In World War II, the physicists committed their sins by making nuclear weapons. And if we ever are stupid enough to be lulled into a World War III, I'm certain that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And that's a paraphrase of Albert Einstein. He was wise enough to realize we couldn't have a survivable World War III. Nobody should ever think that it is possible to survive a World War III. And what this really means is it's time to get rid of nuclear weapons. It's time to get rid of warfare once and for all. I mean, when Putin attacked Ukraine, and then we had the Middle Eastern conflict just boil up out of nowhere. I mean,
Mhm.
just madness, these conflicts and this fighting and killing, especially the killing of innocents, it just absolutely violates everything about the rich spiritual lessons coming from the NDE community about the power of love. And it is high time we grew up into this. And in terms of climate change, I can show you a paper from 1912 where a scientist made it very clear if we kept burning wood and coal, which is what they were burning at the time, that the planet will heat up because carbon dioxide is a very stable gas. We have ways of neutralizing it, buffering it in the oceans, things like that. But we're at the end of all that now, and we've got a real bad problem on our hands. Anyone who denies it is a danger to this world because climate change is really on the edge of extincting thousands of species, including Homo sapiens. It'll make the Middle East and parts of the American South unlivable, in the summertime. It'll be just way too damned hot. And it's time that we took charge of this, developed sustainable energy using solar, wind power, etc. There are many ways to alleviate this problem and get rid of our addiction to fossil fuels because it's killing us and it's killing the planet.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, getting into scientific community, and it's something I grew up like 100% idealizing. And I agree, there are parts to idealize and parts to be realistic about. Now, you mentioned that article, contradicting your story, and there's so much of that in the scientific community. And I can understand the Ed May approach, where he's like, I believe people are telling the truth. I believe this is happening. I don't think the answer is survival. I'm more leaning towards survival, though, but I can understand that, saying we just don't understand what's going on. But you were in the medical community, and what is the snideness? What is the dismissal and lack of curiosity? And what I would actually say is unscientific because they're ignoring the evidence.
Well, I think when you look at the scientific enterprise, I mean, the
Mhm,
scientific method is extremely valuable. It's a great
mhm,
way of getting to objective truth for human beings who want to,
mhm,
who have ways of disagreeing about interpretations and things like that. So the scientific method, I think, is very valuable, but always remember that it deals with things we can measure and quantify. And
mhm.
you can't necessarily easily measure something like love, compassion, kindness, mercy, those kind of things. So the scientific community in general would tend to shy away. But the reason it's important, give one example here, and that has to do with those papers I mentioned on the psychedelics. If
Mhm,
you as a neuroscientist, you say, we have functional MRI, we have magnetoencephalography, we can really study the brains of people under the influence of these substances. So then these people have these profound experiences. Uh, in fact, they can be so profound that they can be healing. One psilocybin dose can be healing for the next year for people with strong addictions, alcohol, narcotics, etc. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins has several great pilot studies that revealed the power of one of such experience to heal. And yet you look at the brain to find the traces of that healing, and you're not going to find it because the brain is getting out of the way. It's going dark. Everything you can measure there. So we're just not able to measure the right things. And some scientists at that point say, well, if we can't measure it, it's not real. Well, that's not true at all because the after effects of what NDEs do to people and how they influence people in a very positive direction is tremendous. And likewise, as Roland Griffiths showed, just that one dose of psilocybin giving an 80% cure rate a year later. It's not like you have to keep taking it. I would say that to me is a situation that could be mimicked beautifully using meditation. I do not recommend the casual use of psychedelics to people. It saddens me to see people who are, say, using ayahuasca on a frequent basis because to me, I haven't seen evidence that that is necessarily given them the spiritual growth that they seem to be claiming. Now, that's not to deny that some people might get a nice catalytic jolt out of such a psychedelic experience, but I warn people be careful because those substances, if you have any kind of mental or spiritual instability, they can really kick you off the cliff. That's why I'm a huge proponent of meditation to get to these same levels, to come to this understanding. And I know through our workshops that people using sacred acoustics is one example, a binaural beat brainwave entrainment that has a very powerful effect on the lower brainstem. I think that's why it allows us to have such profound kind of spiritual journeys above and beyond our normal sense of the ego and the body. But meditation to me is an incredibly good way to engage oneself with this higher soul and come to a deeper understanding of our connections.
And you've done meditations yourself as well, where you mentioned it briefly here as well as in other books of yours, where you have connected with loved ones. You mentioned your
Absolutely. It's a
father.
beautiful way to do it. And we've also
Mhm.
seen that happen in many of our audience participants, some of whom
Mm,
had never been successful meditators. So, not
really?
that sacred acoustics always works, because for some people it doesn't necessarily help, but for many, many people, and if you just go to the testimonials page at sacredacoustics.com, you'll find a lot of stories. And plus, it's been proven, for example, in a scientific pilot study, sacred acoustics was evaluated by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. She wrote a paper in the January 2020 Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases on using binaural beats to treat anxiety. And in her busy Manhattan practice, she found 26% reduction in patients over 2 weeks of listening to sacred acoustics. That's versus only a 7% reduction in anxiety symptoms in the patients who got standard talk therapy. So right there, just by listening these tones, you had a tremendous benefit in getting rid of anxiety symptoms. And it was a state trait anxiety inventory. That was the test that was used. And she showed that it was not only the state, but the trait. So in other words, more kind of long-term changes in a beneficial direction by 2 weeks of listening to sacred acoustics.
And do you find that the meditations, especially when you connect with your loved ones, is it as strong as your NDE? Does it even come close to that?
Well, I would say, depending on the meditation and the intention, it can be very powerful and very strong, very real.
Mhm.
And yet, I have never in my meditative practice encountered that same sense of ultra reality that I experienced in the core and in the Gateway Valley. And it could just be that kind of ultra reality could only be duplicated with that kind of equivalent level of getting rid of the filtering function of my brain and fully engaging in that one mind. Which will happen when I finally leave this physical body. But answer your question, no, I've not duplicated that full sense of ultra reality that was such a hallmark of the deeper aspects of my journey, not through meditation.
And I don't expect an accurate answer on this. I know we touched a little brain as a filter, but as a neurosurgeon, do you have any scientific explanation, the best you could, for how this actually works? Is there like a quantum particle that quantum entangles and microtubules? How does it
I
work?
I would say that quantum entanglement for me is simply the physical manifestation of the mental field that connects us with the mind of the universe and the universe at large across space and time. And that's why it's so important that the Nobel Prize in Physics for Entanglement in 2022, uh, in many ways, was a major step forward for the scientific community in demonstrating kind of our connection with the universe at large. Now, I'm sure there are quantum physicists out there who will scoff at me for claiming that the mental field is the same as the entanglement field. But I think they just don't know enough about conscious phenomena and near death, shared death, reincarnation, all these big stories when you start to put together the fabric of the details of how people are putting them together, you realize we really need to change our worldview very dramatically. It doesn't work to just pretend that we've got this physical world unfolding as we see it independently of our mind and our kind of mental engagement with it. And quantum physics is a huge part of that. And the reason would be that everything that neuroscience has ever attributed to the brain and to neurons involves ion channels and synaptic vesicles. These are all working down at the quantum level. And so every bit of it has always been under the influence of quantum phenomena and quantum fields. And that's what actually causes this thing that we call mentation and kind of phenomenal awareness. And so we just need to understand more about how that top-down causality, that kind of unifying causality of the one mind, is able to unify in working through our brains, this apparent unity of our universe, but then how it connects with the unity of all these fellow souls who also are operating as free agents with true free will. Important to point out that materialist scientists would scoff at you if you claim to have free will. They say it's all electron fluxes, chemical reactions in the brain, stuff that's all following the laws of physics, chemistry, biology. So where would you put free will into that equation? And the way you can put it in is hinted to by a book by John C. Eccles, who won a Nobel Prize in the 60s for his work on ion channels and synaptic vesicles in brains. He was an Australian neurophysiologist, and he made it very clear that the typical arguments of the day, which were conservation of energy arguments against free will, didn't apply. He wrote a book in, I think, the late 1980s called How the Self Controls Its Brain, which made it very clear how this kind of top-down causality could work in the nervous system. And I think we still don't get the details of that. We need to work out the details of it, but it allows us to focus more on what's truly relevant for causal relationships than kind of our imagination of what's causal in neuroscience, philosophy of mind, quantum physics, parapsychology, all its evidence for non-local consciousness. These are all topics that we consolidate in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. So there's already a scientific resource out there for anyone who wants to get much more deeply into it. And also, for your audience, I would say there's a free workbook online that goes with Living in a Mindful Universe. So anybody can access it now. You don't have to pay a thing. Go to ebenalexander.com. That's EBEN Alexander.com. And right there on the welcome page is a 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. Leave your first name, email address, and you'll be off and running with a 33-day email drip campaign where each day you get a new concept from the book. Thousands of people have taken the course. They've left their comments. They've helped each other all there on each of those 33 days. So that is a way to get richly into this right now and start quickly growing. And also, I'll point out, I think it has 4 sacred acoustics files that are associated with that 33-day journey. So that in itself is a great deal that people can access those sacred acoustics files. And again, you're not having to pay anything. It's a gift from us to help people get going on this, to come to a richer understanding.
Well, that's usually my closing question. Where can people find you? Anything you want our audience to
Well,
follow? So if there's anything else you want to add or anything you want me to ask you that I haven't, let me
no,
know.
here we go. One more website of note, innersanctumcenter.com. And that's Karen's wisdom is all behind that site. You'll find many things there. There's a healthcare practitioner course we did with Anna Newsom that does come with a cost attached, but also there's a whole series of, I think, of 50 free interviews we did during the pandemic with consciousness leaders around the world, with other experiencers, etc. But they're all available at innersanctumcenter.com. Highly recommend people go there and enjoy a lot of what's available there to continue their growth in this fascinating topic.
Well, thank you so much. It's always a bit surreal meeting the people who helped me in the earliest unbearable times. So I so appreciate you coming on. So thank
My
you.
pleasure, Liz. Thanks so much for having me on. Thanks for all you do to get this out there, and namaste.
To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFJustHappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?